In the darkest depths of the Vietnam War, between 1965 and 1972, a fearless and daring group of American and Australian soldiers faced an enemy far more sinister than anything seen above ground: the labyrinthine network of tunnels dug by the Viet Cong. They were known as the Tunnel Rats, and their harrowing tales of bravery, courage, and sacrifice have etched their names into history. One such soldier, Sergeant Donald Sloat, exemplified the Tunnel Rats' unwavering commitment to their perilous mission, earning him a posthumous Medal of Honor. Armed with little more than a flashlight, a pistol, and their unyielding determination, these intrepid warriors delved into the claustrophobic confines of the tunnels, navigating booby traps, venomous creatures, and enemy combatants at every turn. As President John F. Kennedy once said, "The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it." The Tunnel Rats were no exception, paying the ultimate price in their pursuit of victory. Join us as we explore the subterranean world of the Tunnel Rats, uncovering the stories of these unsung heroes who faced unimaginable horrors in the suffocating darkness beneath the jungles of Vietnam. Welcome to the Diary of Julius Caesar. Descending into darkness, the unsung heroes of Vietnam's underground war. In the early years of the war, American and Australian forces quickly discovered that the Viet Cong had built an extensive network of underground tunnels throughout South Vietnam. These tunnels, which had been dug by hand using simple tools, served as living quarters, storage areas, and even makeshift hospitals for the Viet Cong. They allowed the enemy to move undetected, launch surprise attacks, and evade capture. It was clear that something had to be done to counter this stealthy and deadly tactic. These soldiers, primarily from the United States and Australia, were specially trained to navigate the treacherous and claustrophobic conditions of the tunnels. They came from various military backgrounds, but shared a common trait: an unwavering courage in the face of danger. One of the most famous tunnel rats was Sergeant Thomas "Tom" H. Taylor, a decorated soldier who served in the 25th Infantry Division. He would later recount his experiences in the tunnels in the 1987 book Tunnel Rat in Vietnam. The Tunnel Rats were not issued any special equipment, so they relied on their wits, resourcefulness, and a few basic tools. With only a flashlight, a pistol, and a knife, they would crawl into the narrow, pitch-black passages, unsure of what awaited them around each corner. The tunnels were often booby-trapped with tripwires, punji sticks, and poisonous snakes, making every step a potential brush with death. As the Tunnel Rats navigated these subterranean mazes, they also had to deal with the ever-present threat of enemy soldiers lying in wait. One anecdote that illustrates the bravery of the Tunnel Rats comes from Staff Sergeant Bill Mole Marshall, who served with the 1st Infantry Division in 1966. During an operation, Marshall discovered a hidden tunnel entrance and crawled in, only to find himself face-to-face with a Viet Cong soldier. In the darkness, the two men grappled, their weapons forgotten. Marshall eventually managed to overpower his opponent, dragging him out of the tunnel to be captured. It wasn't just the physical dangers that the Tunnel Rats faced. The psychological toll of their work was immense. The darkness, the cramped spaces, and the ever-present fear of death could wear on even the strongest of soldiers. But despite the challenges, the Tunnel Rats pressed on, driven by their sense of duty and the knowledge that their work was vital to the war effort. Their efforts were not in vain. The intelligence gathered by the Tunnel Rats helped to map the tunnel systems, identify Viet Cong supply routes, and uncover hidden caches of weapons and supplies. They also played a key role in the destruction of the tunnels, planting explosives and collapsing the intricate passageways to prevent their further use by the enemy. The Tunnel Rats' contributions to the Vietnam War effort were immense, but their stories often go untold. While the war raged above ground, these brave men waged a secret battle beneath the soil of Vietnam. In the words of Tom Taylor, one of their own, the Tunnel Rats were a breed apart, and they knew it. They lived a life of danger, filth, and deprivation that would have driven others mad. It is essential that we remember and honor the sacrifices and heroism of these unsung heroes who faced the darkness and terror of the underground war. Subterranean strongholds, unraveling the secrets of the Viet Cong tunnels. The intricate network of tunnels used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War has long fascinated historians and military enthusiasts alike. These subterranean strongholds, stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the jungles of Vietnam, were a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the Viet Cong forces. This hidden underground world played a pivotal role in the war, providing the Viet Cong with a strategic advantage that confounded their enemies and allowed them to wage a highly effective guerrilla war. The origins of the tunnel systems can be traced back to the late 1940s, when the communist forces, then known as the Viet Minh, began to dig tunnels as a means to evade French colonial forces. The tunnels grew in complexity and scale over the years, eventually reaching their peak during the 1960s. The most famous of these tunnel systems was the Cu Chi tunnels, located just outside of Saigon. Spanning over 150 miles, these tunnels served as the Viet Cong's base of operations for the Tet Offensive in 1968. The construction of the tunnels was an arduous and dangerous process, undertaken primarily by local villagers and Viet Cong soldiers. Equipped with little more than basic hand tools, they dug deep into the earth, removing soil in small woven baskets. The tunnels were typically narrow, measuring only about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, to make them difficult for larger American soldiers to navigate. The tunnels were also intentionally built with multiple twists and turns to impede enemy progress and make it easier to set traps. The tunnel systems were highly organized and efficient, consisting of multiple levels and chambers that served various purposes. They contained living quarters, storage areas for weapons and supplies, and makeshift hospitals where the wounded could be treated. Ventilation shafts ensured a steady supply of fresh air, and hidden entrances and exits allowed the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks or disappear without a trace. Some tunnels even had rudimentary plumbing systems that enabled the Viet Cong to stay underground for extended periods. One of the most fascinating aspects of the tunnel systems was the ingenious traps devised by the Viet Cong to protect their underground sanctuaries. These traps were designed to maim, kill, or capture intruders, and ranged from simple pits filled with sharp bamboo stakes, known as punji traps, to more elaborate contraptions like the swing trap, a heavy log that would swing down and crush an unsuspecting enemy soldier. The tunnels were also known to house venomous snakes, adding another layer of danger to those who dared to enter. The tunnels' strategic importance in the war cannot be overstated. They allowed the Viet Cong to launch surprise attacks against American and South Vietnamese forces, then disappear back into the safety of their underground lairs. They also served as an essential means of communication and coordination among the widely dispersed Viet Cong units, enabling them to stage coordinated assaults on enemy positions. One of the most remarkable stories involving the tunnels occurred in 1966 during the Battle of Tan Son Nhut, when a group of Viet Cong commandos managed to infiltrate the heavily fortified Tan Son Nhut air base by using a tunnel that led directly into the base. Once inside, they launched a devastating attack on the American and South Vietnamese forces stationed there, causing significant damage before retreating back into the safety of their tunnels. The lifeline of the Viet Cong, unveiling the mysteries of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Winding through the rugged terrain of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, the Ho Chi Minh Trail stands as a testament to the resourcefulness and determination of the North Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War. This strategic supply route, named in honor of the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh, played a crucial role in the war, allowing the North to transport troops, weapons and supplies to their Viet Cong comrades in the South. The story of the Ho Chi Minh Trail is one of ingenuity, resilience, and the sheer will to defy the odds in the face of overwhelming adversity. The trail was not a single, clearly defined path, but rather a complex network of roads, footpaths, and river routes that stretched for thousands of miles. It originated in North Vietnam, snaking its way through the densely forested mountains of Laos and Cambodia before reaching its ultimate destination in the south. Construction of the trail began in 1959 as tensions between North and South Vietnam escalated and by the mid-1960s, it had become a vital lifeline for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. To maintain the secrecy of the trail and to protect it from enemy attacks, the North Vietnamese employed a variety of tactics. The dense jungle canopy provided natural camouflage, while decoy trails were established to confuse enemy forces. Ingenious methods were used to ford rivers and traverse mountainous terrain, such as the use of bamboo rafts and makeshift bridges. The North Vietnamese also established a system of way stations along the trail, where troops could rest and resupply before continuing their journey southward. Transporting supplies and troops along the trail was no easy task. The rugged terrain and harsh climate took their toll on both man and machine. Convoys of trucks and pack animals, as well as soldiers on foot, traversed the trail, braving torrential rains, sweltering heat, and the ever-present threat of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Despite these challenges, the North Vietnamese persevered, displaying an unwavering determination to keep the vital supply route open. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a constant thorn in the side of the American and South Vietnamese forces, who struggled to disrupt the flow of supplies and troops. The United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder in 1965, an extensive aerial bombing campaign aimed at destroying the trail and crippling the North Vietnamese war effort. However, the resilience of the North Vietnamese was not to be underestimated. When one section of the trail was damaged, they quickly repaired it or rerouted the supply convoys. The dense jungle canopy made it difficult for American pilots to locate and target the trail effectively. One of the most daring attempts to cut off the trail came in 1970, when US and South Vietnamese forces launched the ill-fated Operation Lam Son 719. This ambitious ground assault aimed to sever the trail at its midpoint in Laos. However, the operation met with fierce resistance from the North Vietnamese, who were well prepared for the attack. After weeks of intense fighting, the Allied forces were forced to withdraw, their mission a failure. The Toxic Legacy: Unearthing the Devastating Impact of Agent Orange. In the annals of the Vietnam War, few topics are as controversial and emotionally charged as the use of Agent Orange. This toxic herbicide, employed by the United States military as part of its chemical warfare strategy, left a tragic and enduring legacy in its wake. The consequences of Agent Orange are still felt today, with its poisonous effects lingering in the environment and afflicting countless innocent civilians who continue to suffer from its devastating health consequences. The story of Agent Orange begins in the early 1960s, when the United States military sought a way to combat the Viet Cong's use of dense jungle foliage as cover for their guerrilla tactics. In response, they turned to a powerful herbicide known as Agent Orange, which was manufactured by companies like Monsanto and Dow Chemical. The herbicide's primary ingredient, dioxin, was a potent toxin known for its ability to kill vegetation quickly and effectively. Beginning in 1961 and continuing until 1971, the United States military conducted a large-scale defoliation campaign known as Operation Ranch Hand. Over the course of the operation, more than 20 million gallons of Agent Orange was sprayed across vast swathes of Vietnam, as well as parts of Laos and Cambodia. The goal was to destroy the dense jungle canopy that provided cover for the Viet Cong and to ruin the crops that sustained them, effectively depriving them of the resources they needed to wage war. The immediate effects of Agent Orange were staggering. Vast areas of lush jungle were transformed into barren wastelands, and once fertile agricultural lands lay in ruins. However, it soon became apparent that the consequences of the herbicide extended far beyond its intended targets. The civilian population of Vietnam began to experience a wide array of health problems, ranging from skin rashes and respiratory issues to birth defects and increased cancer rates. The tragic legacy of Agent Orange was not limited to the Vietnamese people. American servicemen who had been exposed to the herbicide during their tours of duty began to report similar health problems upon returning home. Many of these veterans faced a long and difficult struggle for recognition and compensation for the damage they had suffered at the hands of this toxic chemical. One such veteran, Master Sergeant Elmo R. Zumwalt III, was the son of Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt Jr., who had ordered the use of Agent Orange during his tenure as commander of the U.S. naval forces in Vietnam. The younger Zumwalt, who had been exposed to Agent Orange while serving in Vietnam, was diagnosed with cancer in 1983 and passed away in 1988. His father, racked with guilt over the role he played in the use of the herbicide, became an outspoken advocate for the victims of Agent Orange and dedicated the remainder of his life to raising awareness about the issue. The struggle for justice for the victims of Agent Orange has been long and arduous. In 1984, a class action lawsuit brought by American veterans against the manufacturers of Agent Orange resulted in a $180 million settlement. However, the Vietnamese victims have not been so fortunate. Despite numerous attempts to seek compensation, their pleas for justice have largely fallen on deaf ears. Today, the toxic legacy of Agent Orange continues to haunt the people and the environment of Vietnam. Dioxin, the deadly chemical found in the herbicide, remains in the soil and water, poisoning the land and affecting new generations of Vietnamese. The United States and Vietnam have only recently begun working together on efforts to clean up the contaminated sites and mitigate the ongoing damage caused by this tragic chapter in history. The Tet Offensive, a turning point in hearts and minds. In the early morning hours of January 30th, 1968, the first day of the Lunar New Year known as Tet, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a series of surprise attacks on South Vietnamese and American positions throughout South Vietnam. This massive military campaign, which would come to be known as the Tet Offensive, would shake the foundations of the war effort and forever change the way the conflict was perceived by the American public. As fireworks and celebrations marked the arrival of the new year, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong seized the moment to strike, targeting over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. Among the most significant of these attacks were those on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and the ancient city of Hue, where a brutal battle raged for nearly a month before the city was recaptured by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. The Tet Offensive was orchestrated by General Vo Nguyen Giap, a military strategist who believed that a massive, coordinated assault could demoralize American and South Vietnamese forces, sparking an uprising among the South Vietnamese population and potentially bringing a swift end to the war. While the offensive did not achieve all of its intended objectives, it did succeed in delivering a psychological blow to the American war effort and raising doubts about the viability of victory in Vietnam. Back in the United States, the Tet Offensive came as a shock to a public that had been led to believe that the war was going well and that victory was within reach. The images of the U.S. Embassy under siege and the brutal fighting in the streets of Hue were broadcast into American living rooms, shattering the illusion of a conflict under control and revealing the grim reality of a war with no end in sight. As public opinion began to turn against the war, the American political landscape shifted as well. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been a steadfast supporter of the war effort, faced growing opposition from within his own party and a mounting anti-war movement that would ultimately lead him to announce his decision not to seek re-election in 1968. The Tet Offensive also had a profound impact on the presidential campaign of Richard Nixon, who would go on to win the election that year, promising to bring peace with honor to Vietnam. The Tet Offensive's long-term impact extended beyond the realm of politics, as it raised fundamental questions about the nature of the war and the American role in it. For many, the offensive was a turning point, a moment when the belief in the righteousness of the cause began to waver and the human cost of the conflict came into sharp focus. As journalist Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, said following the offensive, "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could." The Tet Offensive, though not a decisive military victory for the North Vietnamese, proved to be a critical turning point in the Vietnam War, as it exposed the stark reality of the conflict and shook the faith of the American public in their leaders and the cause for which they were fighting. The Invisible Front, a glimpse into the shadows of psychological warfare in Vietnam. In the shadowy world of psychological warfare, the Vietnam War saw both sides deploy an arsenal of propaganda, deception, and terror tactics to sway public opinion and demoralize their enemies. This invisible front of the conflict played a crucial role in shaping the course of the war, often with consequences that reverberated far beyond the battlefield. As we delve into the murky depths of psychological warfare during the Vietnam War, we uncover a gripping tale of manipulation, intrigue, and the hidden power of the human mind. The use of psychological tactics in the Vietnam War was not limited to any one side or faction. The United States and its South Vietnamese allies employed a range of propaganda techniques, both domestically and internationally, to rally support for their cause and to undermine the morale of the enemy. They flooded the airwaves with radio broadcasts and leaflet drops, painting a picture of a just and noble struggle against the spread of communism. One notable example of American psychological warfare efforts was Operation Wandering Soul, launched in 1969. The operation involved the use of loudspeakers to broadcast eerie, pre-recorded sounds of moaning and wailing spirits, which were intended to exploit the Vietnamese belief in the wandering souls of the dead. The goal was to demoralize and frighten the Viet Cong soldiers, weakening their resolve to fight and encouraging them to defect. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were engaged in their own psychological operations, utilizing terror tactics and propaganda to undermine the South Vietnamese government and its American backers. They infiltrated the South's media outlets and spread disinformation, sowing seeds of doubt and confusion among the populace. The Viet Cong also targeted rural villages, using intimidation and violence to coerce the local population into supporting their cause. One of the most chilling examples of the Viet Cong's psychological tactics was their use of assassination squads, known as sapper units, to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. These highly trained commandos would infiltrate South Vietnamese and American installations, silently eliminating high-value targets before vanishing into the night. The sapper unit's deadly efficiency and stealth became a source of dread for their foes, leaving many constantly on edge and looking over their shoulders. The impact of psychological warfare in the Vietnam War was far-reaching, with consequences that extended well beyond the immediate conflict. As the war dragged on, and images of its brutal reality were beamed into living rooms around the world, public opinion began to shift. The once confident American public grew increasingly disillusioned with the war, as the grim realities of the conflict were laid bare for all to see. Anti-war sentiment surged, fueled in part by the media's portrayal of the war and the propagandist efforts of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The psychological warfare waged during the Vietnam War also had a profound impact on the soldiers themselves. Many returned home scarred, not just physically, but also mentally, by the harrowing experiences they had endured. The invisible wounds inflicted by the psychological tactics used during the war would leave a lasting legacy, with countless veterans struggling to come to terms with the trauma they had experienced. The war through the lens, how the media shaped the Vietnam conflict and changed the world. The Vietnam War, often referred to as the First Television War, was a defining moment in the history of journalism and media. As television sets became a staple in American households during the 1960s, the conflict in Vietnam unfolded before the eyes of millions, bringing the stark realities of war into living rooms across the nation. The role of the media in the Vietnam War was unprecedented, its influence on public opinion and political decisions leaving a lasting impact on the course of the conflict and the way wars would be covered in the future. In the early days of the war, American media coverage largely mirrored the government's optimistic narrative, emphasizing the noble cause of fighting communism and protecting democracy in South Vietnam. Journalists embedded with U.S. troops reported on military successes and the camaraderie between soldiers, fostering a sense of national pride and support for the war effort. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the media's portrayal of the conflict began to shift. Journalists on the ground in Vietnam faced with the brutal realities of the war, started to question the official narrative and challenge the government's claims of progress. This newfound skepticism was reflected in their reporting as they exposed the harsh conditions faced by American troops, the atrocities committed by both sides, and the devastating impact of the war on the Vietnamese people. One of the most iconic moments in the media's coverage of the Vietnam War was the Tet Offensive in 1968. Despite the US military's insistence that the enemy was on the verge of defeat, the surprise attack by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong demonstrated that the war was far from over. Images of the fierce fighting in Saigon and other cities were broadcast to millions of viewers, shattering the illusion of an imminent victory and turning public opinion against the war. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, the role of the media in shaping the narrative of the war became even more pronounced. Investigative journalists like Seymour Hersh uncovered shocking stories, such as the My Lai massacre, in which hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians were killed by US soldiers. The publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, a top-secret study that revealed the US government's deception and mismanagement of the war, further eroded public trust and fueled anti-war sentiment. The media's influence extended beyond the American public and reached the highest levels of government. President Lyndon B. Johnson famously remarked that he knew he had lost the support of the American people when Walter Cronkite, the highly respected news anchor of CBS Evening News, voiced his doubts about the war's prospects for success. As opposition to the war grew, political pressure mounted on the government to seek a negotiated settlement and ultimately led to the withdrawal of US forces from Vietnam. The Vietnam War forever changed the relationship between the media and the military. In the conflict's aftermath, the US government and military sought to exert greater control over the flow of information during wartime, implementing policies such as the embedding of journalists with military units during the Gulf War and the Iraq War. Meanwhile, the media's role in shaping public opinion during the Vietnam War has been both praised and criticized, with some arguing that it exposed the truth and held the government accountable, while others claim that it undermined the war effort and demoralized the troops. Voices of dissent, the anti-war movement, and its echoes through history. The Vietnam War, a conflict that raged for nearly 2 decades, inspired an unprecedented wave of anti-war sentiment and activism that reverberated across the United States and beyond its borders. The anti-war movement, fueled by a diverse array of voices and causes, played a pivotal role in shaping government policy, transforming the cultural landscape, and leaving an indelible mark on the course of history. As the war in Vietnam escalated and the human cost became apparent, a groundswell of opposition began to emerge. College campuses across the United States became hotbeds of dissent, with students organizing teach-ins, demonstrations, and protests to voice their concerns about the war. One of the most notable of these early protests took place in 1965 at the University of Michigan, where students and faculty gathered for a 24-hour teach-in to educate their peers about the war's complexities and the reasons behind their opposition. The anti-war movement was not confined to college campuses, however. It spanned a diverse range of social and political groups, from civil rights activists to religious leaders, labor unions to women's groups. Prominent figures such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and musician Joan Baez lent their voices to the cause, speaking out against the war's moral and ethical implications. The movement was further galvanized by the introduction of the draft in 1969, which saw thousands of young men called up to fight in a war that many increasingly saw as unjust and unwinnable. As the anti-war movement gained momentum, it began to influence the cultural landscape of the United States. The peace symbol, initially designed for the British nuclear disarmament movement, became an iconic emblem of the anti-war movement, adorning everything from flags to clothing. Music played a particularly significant role, with artists such as Bob Dylan, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and Marvin Gaye penning powerful anthems that captured the spirit of the times and rallied the masses. The anti-war movement also reached beyond American shores, inspiring protests and demonstrations in countries around the world. In Europe, Asia and Australia, activists took to the streets in solidarity with their American counterparts, denouncing the war and calling for an end to the violence. These international protests helped to build a global consensus against the war, further eroding support for the conflict and pressuring governments to reconsider their positions. The impact of the anti-war movement on government policy cannot be underestimated. The growing public opposition to the war, combined with the media's increasingly critical coverage, forced politicians to take notice. As the tide of public opinion turned, elected officials felt the pressure to seek a negotiated settlement and to bring an end to the war. The anti-war movement's influence was felt most acutely in the 1972 presidential election, in which anti-war candidate George McGovern won the Democratic nomination, signaling the shift in political attitudes towards the conflict. Adrift on the waves of fate, the Odyssey of the Vietnamese boat people. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, a new and harrowing chapter began for the Vietnamese people. As the communist government tightened its grip on the nation, millions sought to escape the hardships, oppression, and uncertainty that lay ahead. Among them were the boat people, a generation of Vietnamese refugees who braved treacherous seas, pirates, and unforgiving elements in search of a better life. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and their journey has left an indelible mark on the nations that opened their doors to these intrepid souls. The exodus of the boat people began in earnest after the fall of Saigon in 1975, as panic gripped the country and thousands scrambled to flee the encroaching communist regime. The first wave of refugees consisted mainly of former military personnel, government officials, and their families, who had collaborated with the United States or the South Vietnamese government and feared persecution or retribution from the new regime. Boarding rickety, overcrowded boats, these desperate men, women, and children set out across the perilous waters of the South China Sea, hoping to find sanctuary in neighboring countries. Many never reached their destination, succumbing to storms, starvation, or the predations of pirates who prowled the waters in search of vulnerable prey. Yet, despite the daunting odds, countless others persevered, driven by the indomitable will to survive and the dream of a better future. The plight of the boat people did not go unnoticed by the international community. As their numbers swelled, the United Nations and humanitarian organizations, such as the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, ICM, launched efforts to aid the refugees and facilitate their resettlement. Countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and France opened their doors to the boat people, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives in a new land. The journey of the boat people was fraught with challenges, both during their perilous sea voyage and upon arrival in their host countries. Many refugees arrived with little more than the clothes on their back, struggling to adapt to an unfamiliar culture, language, and way of life. Yet, time and again, they displayed a remarkable resilience and determination, forging new communities and contributing to the rich tapestry of their adopted homes. The stories of the boat people are as varied as the individuals themselves. There is the tale of Lily Hayslip, who escaped Vietnam on a small fishing boat and went on to become a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist in the United States. Or the story of Nguyen Ngoc Ngan, a former teacher who braved the perils of the open ocean only to endure the hardships of a Malaysian refugee camp before eventually finding a new life in Canada as a renowned author and broadcaster. Echoes of a distant war, the enduring legacy of Vietnam, and the lessons we carry forward. The Vietnam War, a conflict that spanned nearly 2 decades and left an indelible mark on the history of the 20th century, has cast a long shadow over the lives of those who lived through it and the nations that were forever changed by its course. As we reflect on the legacy of this distant war, we must consider not only the scars it left behind, but also the lessons it taught us about the true cost of conflict and the importance of striving for a more just and peaceful world. For the veterans who served in Vietnam, the war was a crucible that tested their courage, their resolve, and their very humanity. They returned home bearing the weight of their experiences, some with physical injuries, others with psychological wounds that would take a lifetime to heal. As they struggled to reintegrate into society, many faced not only the challenges of their own traumas, but also the stigmatization and misunderstanding of a public that had grown disillusioned with the war. The families of these veterans were likewise affected, as they grappled with the emotional toll of caring for their loved ones and navigating the complexities of post-war life. In many cases, the children of Vietnam veterans grew up in the shadow of their parents' experiences, inheriting the legacies of trauma and loss that would shape their own lives and perspectives. The nations involved in the conflict, too, have been indelibly marked by the war's legacy. In Vietnam, the devastation wrought by years of war took a staggering toll on the land and its people, with millions left dead, injured, or displaced. The country has since made remarkable strides in its recovery, emerging as a dynamic and resilient nation that continues to grapple with the enduring consequences of its past. For the United States, the Vietnam War has come to symbolize the limits of American power and the dangers of military intervention. The conflict's protracted and inconclusive nature, combined with the widespread anti-war sentiment at home, has led many to question the wisdom of interventionist policies and the true costs of war. In the years since Vietnam, the lessons of the conflict have informed American foreign policy, shaping the way the nation approaches military engagements and diplomacy. As our journey through the complex and multifaceted history of the Vietnam War comes to a close, we find ourselves with a deeper understanding of the events, the people, and the lasting impact of this tumultuous period. Let us take a moment to reflect on the words of the celebrated Vietnamese Zen master and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh, who once said, "When you understand the suffering and the roots of the suffering, compassion can arise." In remembering the suffering and the sacrifices of all those touched by the Vietnam War, let us strive to cultivate compassion, understanding, and a steadfast commitment to a more peaceful and just world. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening exploration of the Vietnam War, and may the lessons we have learned serve as a guiding light in the pursuit of a better tomorrow. Goodbye, and until we meet again on another journey through the pages of history.